So, welcome to Expressen. Welcome everyone who's still here from the previous debate, and also welcome all our new audience. And please welcome Professor Ian Buruma. You're a professor of human rights and journalism.
Yes, but that's so vague that it could mean anything.
Okay. But anyway, you're here because of this book, År noll in Swedish, Year Zero, which is the year of 1945, the year when the Second World War ended, and the era that we're still in started, the post-war era that we're still in. What made you want to write a book about 1945?
Well, first of all, I'm not so sure we are still in that era. I think we still see echoes of it, but in some ways, it's the post-war era is over, and the idealism that came after the catastrophe of World War II, the sort of collective idealism that now we have to build a better world and social democracy and the United Nations and a united Europe and all that, that has more or less disappeared. So in some ways we're no longer in that period. In any case, your question, there was a personal reason and there were more general political reasons. The personal reason is that my generation, I was born in December 1951. We grew up very much in the shadow of World War II. If you lived in a country that had been occupied by the Germans, we were all rather obsessed by it. Partly because in a country like Holland, where I grew up, it was the most exciting thing that had happened since the Napoleonic invasion. But also because occupation and war and dictatorship and so on creates moral dilemmas in the lives of people that we who grew up in peace never have to face. Like, do you take in a Jew to hide in your house even though it might endanger your family, and that kind of thing. So we were all obsessed by it. Also, growing up in Holland in the 50s and 60s, it was very nice to feel that you were one of the good guys and that the Germans were bad guys. Yes. So there was a kind of very easy moral equation. Now later, of course, I began to see the world in more relative terms. It was also a way to understand the world of my parents and how they grew up. So I start with a story about my father. Mm-hmm. Now the more general political story is that I felt a lot of people who promoted the war in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, and specifically the neoconservatives in the United States, were often too young to remember the war personally, and thought rather laconically about it. They sort of almost imagined that if you get rid of Saddam Hussein or any other dictator, then things will somehow be okay. Yeah. And I wanted to show, by showing what happened after the war was over in 1945, how not okay it is, and how war and occupation creates violence, civil wars, revenge, massive numbers of people who lose their homes, it tears societies apart and so on. So even just wars end in all kinds of catastrophes. So you cannot simply think that starting a war, even against a nasty dictator, is going to be without terrible costs.
And your book is excellent, and you should also say that it's for sale after our discussion. So as you know, of course, that this part of Europe, Sweden, has been spared from war for 2 centuries or more, which means that someone like me, I have never personally experienced war, but also I have no family recollection of war. If you ask me to name an ancestor who has fought in a war, I would be unable to give an answer. It's too far back. So war is just not part of my identity as a person. What is the hardest thing for me to understand about war? What is the greatest misconception I have about war?
I have no idea. What is hard for you?
But
the Swedes probably did enough war in the 30 Years' War that was enough for a few centuries.
Yes, of course.
well, I mean, I'm not entirely the right person to ask because I didn't experience a war either.
No, but you still have family
yes, that's
members
true.
of it.
And well, I mean, having parents who were in wars and so on is not necessarily an advantage, because you can identify with their experiences in ways that are in some ways unjustified. I mean, my mother was born in London. She was in England during the war, but she was from a Jewish family. So if England had been invaded, or if she still lived in the country of her ancestors, Germany, she probably would have been killed. And it's very easy, if you have a Jewish background, then to start identifying with the victims and thinking, well, if I'd been alive, I might have been in a camp too, giving yourself a kind of warm moral sense, which is unearned. And so it's not necessarily an advantage. You can emotionally fall into all kinds of traps by identifying too much with people who experience things that you yourself did not. So I'm not sure that you're at a disadvantage. I mean, I look at war from a certain distance. I suppose the big difference is that for my generation, if you grew up in a country that had been occupied, one grew up very strongly that the World War II gave you a moral yardstick. Yeah. Everything was judged according to what you think people would have done during the war. And so, which can be misleading, but it also gives you a very strong sense of what is right and what is wrong. Mm-hmm. Now, as you grow up and as you read more, you realize that there are many gray areas, that when I was at primary school or when I grew up, things seemed much too morally simple. And of course, when I went to primary school, all my teachers had stories about being brave resistors and so on, which was mostly nonsense. And we read boys' books, and boys' comics were usually about war heroes, and I read English comics about Spitfire pilots and so on. So the world is very neatly divided into good guys and bad guys. Now, as I said later, if you have a brain, you realize that this is not an entirely fair view of the world.
Because for someone like me, I grew up with teachers who did not have that. So, I mean, being a collaborator or not being a collaborator, etc., being in the resistance, that was not an issue, which means that that's a whole gray area for us. I think that's a very interesting difference that you're pointing out.
Well, Sweden's whole position in the war was a gray area.
Exactly.
So that makes things complicated. It's like Switzerland in some ways.
I do have one connection to the war, and that's something I would like to bring up, that I am a grandchild of year zero, which means that my mother was conceived on the day that Copenhagen was liberated from the Nazis. My mom is Danish, and she was conceived on the day of the so-called Befrielsen, the day of
liberation.
Liberation, exactly. And there are many stories like that, something that you write about quite a lot is that sexuality in ugly forms or less ugly forms flourished during year zero.
Well, the ugly form was largely massive numbers of rapes committed by by soldiers of the Soviet Red Army. But the other forms, which in some ways are much more interesting and more positive. Many people from the Red Cross and so on who went into the concentration camps to help the survivors were very shocked that people who'd survived the horrors of being in a Nazi concentration camp were starving, barely alive and so on, were very quickly extremely sexually active.
Wow.
And there was enormous amount of screwing in the concentration camps among the survivors. And a lot of the people who went there to help them were rather shocked by this. But in fact, it's very understandable. It wasn't that they had lost... One interpretation was that they'd lost all moral feeling and sense and so on, all sense of respectability. It wasn't so much that. It was also because after years of death and misery and horror, people simply craved some kind of human warmth, just a connection. There was also almost a biological urge that after death you reproduce. Yeah. And so in some of the old concentration camps, there were Zionist organizations who were very active. And they actually stopped people from getting contraceptives. They wanted people to produce children as quickly as possible as a reaction against the danger of being exterminated.
Yes, of course.
And so, and on a much less dramatic level, countries that had been occupied for 5 years, men were demoralized, they were often not in good health, they had no money, there were not that many, women had had an awful time, and so the presence of large numbers of well-fed, smart troops from America and Canada and so on in crisp uniforms who had silk stockings and chocolates and so on, of course that led to one great party for a while, much to the chagrin of the men in these countries who didn't like to see this at all. But it's entirely understandable that these women wanted a good time. And it was a sort of crazy period of liberation, which then very quickly ended. And a lot of the men in countries like Holland, France, and so on who saw this were very shocked, of course, because they felt women were getting out of control. And so I think a lot of the conservatism of the 1950s was a reaction against this, of not just of moral, but it was men reasserting their control over women. And women had become more independent because of war anyway, because men were away, they were in camps, they were prisoners. Women had to take jobs in industry, they had to take care of their families, and so they were empowered in many ways by war. And so I think that the conservatism of the 50s was in some ways a male reaction against this.
A backlash, this is I will have 3 conversations on the Second World War during this fair. Yesterday I spoke to British historian Anthony Beevor, very interesting. Tomorrow I will speak to Anders Rydell, author of Boktjuvarna, about the plundering of books and sometimes entire libraries during World War II. And I'm talking to you. Why? So it's been 70 years. I wasn't born, you weren't born, and we're still spending so much time writing about the World War II, reading about it, talking about it. Why?
Well, as I said, I think because for many countries it was the most dramatic thing to have happened since Napoleon. We can't forget it, and so much of our own lives were shaped by it. I mean, the institutions we live with, our ideas about morals and politics and so on were shaped by the experience of World War II, and just the sheer drama of it is still unforgettable. I think another generation, people who are now in their 20s, for them it's now gradually becoming history in the way that, for me, World War I is history.
And what will be their great event? September 11th?
No, because that was one horrific event. It's not like a war that lasts for 5 years.
No.
The other thing, of course, well, there are 2 other things which make it unforgettable, because in some ways it's mysterious and shocking. The fact that one of the most civilized and highly educated countries in Europe, i.e. Germany, could so quickly descend into such horrific behavior and such barbarism. And so what is frightening about the human condition is that barbarism is so close under the surface of civilization. You just scratch it and people can become wild animals. And that's one thing I think that keeps us fascinated by it. The other thing is the Holocaust, which was something of such unprecedented horror that we still haven't quite, we'll never be able to entirely live with that.
But it's also as if we're still constantly re-evaluating World War II and finding new things to talk about, new topics. This thing that you're writing about, which is fascinating, about the sexuality that flourished in the concentration camps after liberation, something that I'd never heard of. There are still, new stories, new ground being uncovered, so to speak. Why is that?
Well, because we look at different things, and that's part of interpreting history. I mean, history writing, any period in history, just today, there are millions and millions and millions of things that are happening all around us. Now, a historian will only pick a few things out of that seem significant. And what seems significant at one moment, 10 years later, may not seem so significant. So it's an endless sifting of facts and events and so on, and interpreting them, reinterpreting them, and that's what history is.
When you look at Europe today, with the challenges that we face with refugees and war, climate change, economic problems, maybe depression around the corner, or depression as a fact for some countries, what lessons can we learn, or what lessons have you learned from working on this book?
Well, I'm very skeptical about lessons because I think people often learn the wrong lessons. And I think history is it's very important to know history because without it we wouldn't understand ourselves and the world we live in. But I think so much of history is picking certain things out that learning lessons is a risky enterprise because people often pick the wrong things out. And I mean, the war in the Balkans was fought by the Serbs often in name of a medieval battle that happened many centuries ago and used for all the wrong reasons to whip people up into aggression against the Bosnians. So I'm not sure about lessons. I think all you can hope for is that it enables you to understand things better. But great lessons I would hesitate to draw.
Because something that I think about is that the idealism that you write about in your book, that the hopes for a new future, or the hope even for some kind of world organization, which then became the UN, which is now, for me, a huge disappointment, in fact. But people hoped for a brighter world, that this will never happen again. That's what you said. This can never happen again. Now humanity have learned from this and will move on. That's something, that kind of disappointment, I think, is interesting to keep in mind. Now when we talk about Arab Spring, or we talk about, different things around the corner that will make our lives better.
Well, maybe we shouldn't be so disappointed because that thing didn't happen again. Other horrible things happen. And so history never repeats itself exactly. And so terrible wars will never happen again. I mean, that would be an absurd statement. Of course they'll happen again. Human atrocities will never happen again. Yes, they will happen again. They won't happen in exactly the same way, which is why history is not a very dependable guide. But some things have been good. I mean, one of the main reasons that behind the idea of a European Union was so that France and Germany would never go to war again. Well, it's become almost unthinkable now, unimaginable that France and Germany would go to war, and that's an achievement.
Yes, it is. Well, we're running out of time. Thank you very much for coming to Expressen.
Thank you,
and I hope you enjoy the rest of the fair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian Buruma. Welcome.